The moment Lydia Harper realized she had been left behind, the sky opened up and poured rain down on her like heaven itself was laughing at the joke her life had become. She sat in the middle of the main street of Clover Ridge, Wyoming Territory, in the year 1882, with a single carpetbag beside her and a soaked telegram clutched in her shaking fingers. The ink had run so badly she could barely read the words anymore, but she did not need to read them. She had already memorized every cutting syllable the moment the stagecoach driver had handed her the folded paper and told her, with a kind but pitying expression, that her intended was not coming to collect her. The telegram from a man named Percy Whitfield had said, simply, "Have reconsidered. Arrangements dissolved. Do not come to the ranch. Find your own way. Find your own way." She had traveled from Cincinnati, Ohio, for 3 weeks on trains and stagecoaches, bouncing over rutted roads and sleeping sitting upright in crowded coaches with strangers who smelled of tobacco and livestock. She had sold most of her mother's china to fund the journey. She had written to Percy Whitfield 6 times over the course of 2 months, careful, hopeful letters full of the kind of optimism that a 24-year-old woman with no remaining family and very little money could manufacture when she decided to answer a mail-order advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette. The advertisement had read, "Respectable rancher, 31, seeks honest and hardworking woman of good character for the purpose of marriage and building a life in Wyoming Territory. Must be willing to embrace frontier living." Lydia had been willing to embrace anything. She had been willing to cross the entire country on the back of a mule if it meant she would not spend another winter alone in a boarding house, working herself half to death as a seamstress for barely enough to pay the rent. And so here she was, sitting in the mud on the main street of a town she had never seen before, with a carpetbag that contained everything she owned in the world, and rain soaking through her best traveling dress until it clung to her like a second skin. The other passengers on the stagecoach had long since scattered, ducking under awnings and into the saloon and the general store. The stagecoach driver had offered to take her back east on his return trip, but she had shaken her head, not yet able to form words. He had given her a sorrowful look and driven on. The mud was cold. She could feel it seeping through her skirts and soaking her stockings. She knew she should stand up. She knew she should walk into one of the establishments on the street and find help or at least shelter. But for a long, terrible moment, she simply sat there and let the rain fall on her and felt the full weight of everything she had lost and everything she had never had pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. She had been 20 years old when her father died of a fever, leaving her and her mother with only debts and a rented house. Her mother had lasted 2 more years before her heart gave out, and Lydia had suspected for a long time that it was grief more than any physical ailment that had taken her. She had worked as a seamstress for 4 years after that, stitching other women's wedding dresses and party gowns while eating her suppers alone in a small room with a single window that looked out over an alley. She had answered Percy Whitfield's advertisement because she had genuinely believed that starting over, building something real with her own hands on fresh land, was exactly what she needed and what she deserved. She had not believed it would end in a telegram and a puddle in Wyoming. She heard the horse before she saw it, a deep, steady rhythm of hoofbeats slowing from a canter to a walk, then stopping altogether on the street in front of her. She did not look up immediately. She was not sure she had the energy to care who it was, but then a shadow fell over her and a voice said, "Ma'am, are you injured?" It was a low voice, steady and unhurried in the way of people who were accustomed to making themselves heard without raising their volume. Lydia looked up. The man standing over her was broad-shouldered and tall, wearing a dark hat with rain sliding off its brim in a thin curtain. He had dark eyes the color of strong coffee, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains visible in the far distance behind the rooftops of Clover Ridge. He was perhaps 30, or close to it, and the worn quality of his leather coat and the easy, practiced way he had stepped off his horse without needing to think about it, told her immediately that this was a man who lived and worked outdoors. He was also, she realized with some distant part of her brain that was still functioning correctly, extraordinarily handsome in a rugged, unpolished way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with the way he stood, as though the ground beneath him belonged to him without question. He was looking at her with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite confusion, but something in between, the look of a man who had seen unexpected things in unexpected places before, but still found himself occasionally surprised by the world. "I am not injured," she said. Her voice came out more even than she expected, given that she had been on the verge of tears moments before. "I am simply sitting." He looked at the mud around her, at the soaked carpetbag, at the ruined telegram in her hand. He looked back at her face. "You are sitting in a considerable amount of mud," he said carefully. "Yes," Lydia agreed. "I am aware." He was quiet for a moment. Most men, she thought, would have already moved on by now, satisfied that she was not in immediate physical danger and not wishing to involve themselves in whatever complicated situation had deposited a woman in the mud on the main street of Clover Ridge. But this man stayed where he was, holding his horse's reins loosely in one hand, the animal breathing quietly beside him in the rain. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked. The question was so direct and so simply kind that it caught her off guard. She felt her composure crack just slightly at the edges. "I did," she said. "As of this morning, I no longer do." He nodded once slowly, as though this answer made complete sense to him. He looked up the street toward the hotel, a two-story wooden building with a sign that swung in the wind, then looked back at her. "The hotel at the end of the street is run by a woman named Martha Beale," he said. "She is a decent woman. She will not charge you more than you can pay, and if you tell her Grant Rourke sent you, she will see that you are looked after." He reached into his coat and produced a coin which he held out to her without condescension, as though offering practical help was simply the natural thing to do. Lydia stared at it for a moment. Then she looked up at him again. "Grant Rourke," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. You are very free with your name." The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "Most people in Clover Ridge know it already. It saves time." She took the coin. She looked at it in her palm. It was more than she had expected, enough to cover several nights at a modest hotel. "I am Lydia Harper," she said, "from Cincinnati." "Long way to come," he said. "In this weather." "In any weather," she agreed quietly. He looked at her for one more moment, and she thought she saw something shift in his expression, something thoughtful and searching that was quickly set aside in favor of practicality. He touched the brim of his hat. "The hotel will have hot water and dry clothes if Martha takes a liking to you," he said. "She usually does." Then he swung back up onto his horse with the effortless ease of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it, and he rode away up the street in the rain, and Lydia sat in the mud for another 30 seconds watching him go before she picked up her carpetbag, got to her feet with as much dignity as she could manage, and walked toward the hotel. Martha Beale was exactly as described. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman of perhaps 55, with gray hair pinned severely back and hands roughened by 30 years of frontier life. She took one look at Lydia dripping on her front porch, said, "Grant Rourke sent you." And when Lydia nodded, opened the door wider and said, "Come in out of that rain before you drown standing up." Martha did not ask a great many questions that first evening. She showed Lydia to a small room on the second floor with a clean bed and a window that looked out over the backs of the buildings toward the open land beyond the town. She sent hot water up for a bath. She sent a bowl of thick beef stew and a wedge of cornbread with it. And when she came to collect the tray an hour later, she sat in the single chair in the room and looked at Lydia, clean and dry in a borrowed dress and wrapped in a blanket on the edge of the bed, and said, "Do you want to tell me, or would you rather I guessed?" "I came as a May-lord or bride," Lydia said. She had decided already that there was no point in pretense. The man reconsidered, by telegram, after I had already traveled 3 weeks to get here. Martha's expression did not change, but something hard moved through her eyes. "Percy Whitfield," she said. Lydia blinked. "You know him?" "I know of him," Martha said, in the tone that meant she knew considerably more than she was going to share. "He has a small ranch 2 miles south of town. Has had 3 arranged marriages fall through in the past 4 years. 2 of the women managed to leave before they arrived. You are the first one he has managed to get this far before changing his mind." Lydia absorbed this. "That is," she said carefully, "extremely discouraging information." "Yes," Martha agreed. "I imagine it is." She looked at Lydia with a calculating expression that was not unkind. "Do you have any money?" "A little, and what Mr. Rourke gave me." "Grant gave you money?" "He did, on the street." Martha's expression changed slightly, something softening at the edges. "That sounds like him," she said, more to herself than to Lydia. "Well, you can stay here until you figure out what you want to do next. I will put you to work in exchange for room and board if the money runs thin. I can always use another pair of hands." "I am an excellent seamstress," Lydia said. "I also cook, clean, do laundry, and I can keep accounts." "Can you?" Martha said with the look of someone who had just been unexpectedly interested. "That is more useful than you know. My record-keeping is a disaster." She stood up. "Get some sleep, Miss Harper. Things will look less terrible in the morning." They did a little. The rain had stopped overnight, and the town of Clover Ridge looked almost charming in the early morning light, the unpaved streets drying quickly in the summer heat, and the mountains in the distance turning a brilliant blue-purple against the pale gold of the sky. Lydia stood at her window with her first cup of coffee, which Martha had sent up with a girl of about 15 named Alice who worked in the kitchen, and she looked out over the frontier and made herself a quiet but firm promise. She would not go back to Cincinnati. Not yet. Not with nothing. She had come west to build something, and she was going to build something, even if it was not the thing she had originally planned. She spent her first full day in Clover Ridge helping Martha with the hotel accounts, which were indeed a disaster, and also mending a collection of shirts and trousers that had been left by guests and never collected. She was good with a needle, and she was good with numbers, and she found that having her hands occupied gave her mind the structure it needed to stop replaying the humiliation of the day before. She did not think she had seen the last of Grant Rourke. She was right. He came into the hotel the following afternoon for what Martha told her was his usual monthly visit to settle accounts. He had rooms at the hotel reserved on a standing basis for his ranch hands when they came into town, and he liked to pay his bills in person rather than by courier. Lydia was behind the front desk when he came in, because Martha had trusted her with the afternoon duties by the second day, which said something about Martha's efficiency and also about Lydia's quiet competence. She heard the door and looked up, and there he was, hat in hand this time because he was indoors, and his dark hair was slightly damp at the temples as though he had ridden fast and recently. He stopped when he saw her. She felt illogically a brief moment of nerves that she pushed back down firmly. "Miss Harper," he said. He sounded neither surprised nor unsurprised. He sounded, she thought, genuinely pleased. "Martha put you to work." "She did," Lydia agreed. "I am grateful for it. How may I help you, Mr. Rourke?" He settled his hat on the peg by the door, which was where the regulars hung them, and came to the desk. He was even taller than she had remembered. Or perhaps it was simply that she had been sitting in the mud, the first time she had looked up at him, and everything had seemed large from that vantage point. "I am here to settle the accounts for my men's rooms," he said. He named the hands who had been in town that month, 3 of them, and the dates they had stayed. Lydia looked up the records in Martha's ledger and gave him the total. He paid without question in cash, and she wrote the receipt in a neat hand. He did not leave immediately after. He stood at the desk looking at her with that thoughtful, unhurried quality she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "How are you finding Clover Ridge?" he asked. "I have only been here 2 days," she said, "but it seems like a reasonable town." "It has its good qualities," he agreed, "and its less good ones. Most places do," he nodded. He looked at the ledger, then back at her. "I heard about Whitfield," he said, simply and without preamble. "Not my business ordinarily, but I wanted you to know it reflects nothing on you. Percy Whitfield is a man who does not know what he wants and does not care particularly who he inconveniences while he is in the process of not knowing." It was a more considered and more honest thing to say than she had expected, and it landed somewhere in the center of her chest with surprising warmth. "Thank you," she said. "That is a kind thing to say." "It is a true thing to say," he replied. "Whether it is kind depends on whether the truth helps." She thought about it. "In this case," she said, "I believe it does." Something moved across his expression, quick and warm and then carefully neutral again, as though he was not yet ready to show her what it was. "Good," he said. He picked up his hat from the peg. "Good afternoon, Miss Harper." "Good afternoon, Mr. Rourke." He left. Lydia watched the door close behind him and then stood very still for a moment, with the receipt book in her hands and a peculiar sensation in her chest that she firmly refused to examine too closely. Over the following 2 weeks, she settled into a routine. She worked the front desk for Martha in the mornings, kept the accounts in the afternoons, and spent her evenings doing piecework sewing, both mending for hotel guests and alterations for 2 of the women in town who had heard she was skilled with a needle. Martha paid her a small wage in addition to room and board, and Lydia began, very carefully, to set money aside. She also began to know the town. Clover Ridge had perhaps 300 permanent residents and a shifting population of ranch hands, travelers, and the various business people who served them. There was a general store run by a man named Howard Crane and his wife Nell, who were enormously friendly and seemed to know everything about everyone in a radius of 50 miles. There was a livery stable, a blacksmith, a church of modest dimensions, a school that held classes 3 days a week, and a saloon that was louder on Saturday nights than on any other night. There was a doctor, a tall and thin man named Dr. Aldous Finch, who had trained in Philadelphia and come west for reasons he never fully explained, but who was excellent at his work. And there was Grant Rourke, who was not in town most of the time but whose presence was felt everywhere in it anyway. She learned this through accumulation. When she mentioned his name to Howard Crane in the general store, Howard launched into a 10-minute discussion of everything Grant had done to help the town in the past 5 years, from funding the expansion of the schoolhouse to organizing the water rights negotiation with the neighboring territory that had prevented a land dispute from turning ugly. When she asked Martha about him one evening, Martha got a particular look on her face that was both fond and careful and said, "Grant Rourke is the best man in this county, Miss Harper, and that is not an opinion. It is a simple statement of fact." He had inherited the Rourke Ranch from his father 8 years ago, when he was 22, and had built it from a medium-sized cattle operation into the largest and most profitable ranch in the county. He employed 14 men full-time and additional hands during the season. He was fair with his workers in an era when fairness was not common, paying wages that were honest and treating his men with consideration. He had never married. Various women in the county had hoped he would marry them, according to Nell Crane, who told Lydia this with the frank openness of someone who had long ago decided that pretending the obvious was not obvious served no one. "There was a woman in Laramie 2 years ago," Nell told her, wrapping a paper parcel of buttons for Lydia's work. "People thought it would come to something, but it didn't. Grant is not a man who will settle for something that doesn't feel exactly right to him, and I think he respects that woman too much to have let her go on hoping when he knew it wasn't right." Lydia absorbed this information with the careful, neutral expression she had been practicing since childhood, the expression that said she was interested but not overly interested, that she was listening but not drawing conclusions. She was absolutely drawing conclusions. She was just keeping them quiet, because they were premature and she was a practical woman, and she had already been humiliated once in Clover Ridge, and she was not eager to repeat the experience. What she could not stop noticing was that Grant Rourke came to the hotel considerably more often than his once-a-month accounting visit suggested was strictly necessary. He came in 3 days after the accounting visit to ask Martha a question about a guest who had damaged a room, because the guest was one of his ranch hands. He came in the following week to deliver a side of beef that Lydia later learned he sent to Martha every month as partial payment on an old debt, though the debt had long since been settled, and Martha simply accepted it without comment. He came the week after that because, he said, he had heard there was a new seamstress in town, and he had several shirts that needed new collars. This last visit resulted in Lydia taking his measurements in the small sitting room off the lobby, while Martha made tea in the kitchen and did not visibly try to listen, though Lydia was not entirely convinced. Standing close enough to Grant Rourke to measure his shoulders with a cloth tape was an educational experience. He was very still and very quiet while she worked, which made the task easier and also considerably more unsettling. He smelled of leather and horse, and something underneath that was simply clean and warm and entirely masculine. His shoulders were broader than she had anticipated from a distance. She noted all of this with the professional calm of a woman who had been measuring and fitting garments for years, and she locked every observation in a box in the back of her mind and kept her face entirely composed. "You are very efficient," he said, while she was writing down the measurements. "Efficiency is a virtue in this profession," she said, "though I confess the virtue is partly self-defense. If I am working quickly, there is less time to wonder whether the conversation will go anywhere unusual." He looked at her with what she was coming to recognize as his amusement expression, which was quieter than most people's and lived primarily in the area around his eyes. "Does the conversation usually go unusual places?" "When men are being fitted for shirts, not usually. When men ask a woman in a hotel sitting room unusual questions while she has a measuring tape, occasionally." "I have not asked you any unusual questions," he said. "Not yet," she agreed pleasantly and went on writing. He laughed. It was a short, genuine laugh, the kind that surprised the person producing it, and it made his whole face change in a way that was extremely distracting. Lydia kept writing. "Where did you learn to sew?" he asked after a moment. "My mother taught me," she said. "She was a very good seamstress, better than I am, though I have been working at it for 20 years, so I am adequate." She looked up from her notes. "Why did you come to Wyoming Territory, Mr. Rourke? You are not from here, I think." He looked momentarily surprised, which she suspected was a rare expression for him. "What makes you say that?" "Your vowels," she said. "They have the faintest residue of somewhere east, not far east, perhaps Maryland or Virginia, but somewhere." He was quiet for a moment, the way he went quiet when he was considering something seriously. "Virginia," he said. "My father brought us west when I was 12. He wanted land, and Virginia was running short of it. Or short of the kind he could afford." He paused. "He found more than he expected here. So did I, your father," she said gently. "Martha mentioned he passed some years ago. 8 years. He built the ranch to a certain point and then left it to me to take further. He said it simply, without grief that was still raw, but with the weight of something that had been carried long enough to become part of how he stood. He was a good man. Not easy, but good." "Mine as well," Lydia said. "Not easy, but good." They looked at each other for a moment with the particular recognition of people who have discovered an unexpected commonality. She delivered the finished shirts 2 weeks later, bringing them to the ranch because he had mentioned it was difficult to get away during calving preparations, and she had offered to ride out with Alice, who was doing an errand in that direction anyway. She had been on the back of a horse precisely 3 times in her life, all as a child, and Alice's assessment of her riding form was diplomatically limited to "you are staying on," which is the important part. The Rourke Ranch was larger than she had imagined. It occupied a wide valley backed by a crescent of pine-covered hills, and the main house was 2 stories of solid timber with a porch that ran the entire front length and windows that looked out over the pasture land where cattle grazed in slow, contented clusters. It was clearly built by someone who intended to stay and intended to be comfortable. And it had the well-maintained, purposeful look of a place that was actively loved rather than merely inhabited. Grant came out onto the porch when he heard them ride up, and she registered the way his expression shifted when he saw her, a brief and genuine moment of pleased surprise, before it settled into its usual composed warmth. He helped her down from the horse. He did not strictly need to, but he offered his hand and she took it, and for a moment she stood on the ground looking up at him with his hand still in hers, and the sun was warm and the air smelled of grass and cattle and pine, and everything was very still. Then Alice coughed diplomatically, and Grant released her hand and went to look at the shirts, which he declared extremely well done. "You have a beautiful property," Lydia told him, standing on the porch and looking out over the valley. "Thank you," he said. He came to stand beside her, not too close, but close enough that she was aware of him as a presence. "It is better in the mornings. There is a mist that comes off the creek just after dawn that sits in the low places, and the cattle come out of it like shapes from a painting." She turned to look at him, surprised by the poetry of it. He looked slightly self-conscious. "I'm not often given to that kind of description," he said. "I think it was exactly the right kind of description," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was doing something to the planes of his face that was entirely unfair. She made herself look back at the valley. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that it comes from genuine interest and not from any attempt to cause difficulty." "All right," she said. "What do you intend to do, here, I mean? Are you planning to stay in Clover Ridge or move on eventually?" She thought about it carefully, as the question deserved. "I intend to stay," she said. "I have thought about it quite a lot in the past few weeks. I came west because I wanted to build something, and I found that wanting that is actually separate from who I was supposed to build it with. I like this country. I like Martha. I have the beginning of work that can support me, and I believe I can make more of it in time." She paused. "I do not intend to be a charity case or a guest indefinitely. I mean to make my own place here." He was quiet for a moment. "I believe you will," he said, and the way he said it, simple and direct and completely without the condescension that was often mixed into men's encouragements when they spoke to women about ambition, landed on her like something warm and solid. "Thank you, Mr. Rourke," she said. "Grant," he said, "if it is not too forward." "It is not too forward," she said. "Lydia," he smiled. It was the full version this time, not just the edge of one, and it transformed him so thoroughly that she caught her breath. She rode back to town with Alice as the sun began its afternoon descent, and she did not say very much, and Alice, who was 15 and observant, did not ask. The weeks passed, and the beginning of September brought cooler mornings and the brilliant, clean sky, weather that the Wyoming Territory wore like its best coat in the early fall. Lydia's sewing work had grown. She had 3 regular clients now in addition to the hotel mending, and she had begun to think about whether there was enough demand in Clover Ridge and the surrounding ranches to justify renting a small space of her own rather than working from her hotel room. She discussed this with Martha, who listened with the concentrated attention she gave to all practical matters, and then said, "There is a room at the back of Howard Crane's store. It faces the street from the side. He has been using it for storage, but it is more room than he needs. Ask him." She asked Howard Crane, and Howard asked Nell, and Nell said yes before Howard had finished explaining the question. And by the end of the week, Lydia had a small workroom with 2 windows and a door that opened onto the side street, and she had painted a small sign that said "Harper's Alterations and Dressmaking" in careful letters, and hung it above the door. Grant came to see it. He appeared on a Tuesday morning in late September, coming in through the front door of the Cranes' general store, and making his way to the back with the easy confidence of a man who went where he intended to go. And he stood in the doorway of her workroom and looked at the bolts of fabric on the shelves and the dress form in the corner and the clean-swept floor and the sign visible through the window, and she could see something in his face that was deeply, quietly pleased. "This suits you," he said. "It does," she agreed. She was pinning a hem on a length of green wool, and she kept working, because stopping every time Grant Rourke came to see her would have made it impossible to get anything done, given how frequently he seemed to appear. "Would you like coffee? Martha sent me with enough for an army." "Yes," he said, and came inside and sat on the stool she kept for clients and took the tin cup she poured for him and drank it without pretense. This was what she had come to love about him, she admitted to herself privately. Somewhere around the third cup of coffee and the sixth visit and the ninth conversation that left her feeling simultaneously more like herself and like a better version of herself than she had been before. He was completely without pretense. He was direct without being harsh, and kind without being soft, and he had a quality of attention when he listened to her that made every word she said feel like it was worth saying. He treated her as an equal in a time and place where that was not guaranteed, and he never made her feel that her history, the mail-order arrangement, the mud of the main street, the telegram that had dissolved her plans, was something to be embarrassed about. He also, she was increasingly aware, looked at her in a way that had nothing to do with polite interest or friendly concern. He looked at her the way a man looks at a woman when he is trying to be careful and is finding it increasingly difficult. She was finding it increasingly difficult herself. The breaking point, or rather the turning point, came on a Saturday at the end of September when the Whitfields gave a party. She had not known Percy Whitfield had a sister until Nell Crane mentioned it, and she had not known the sister hosted a social gathering at the Whitfield ranch every fall until Martha told her about it the morning of the event. Every significant ranching family in the county attended. It was, Martha said, one of the few occasions in the year when the dispersed ranching community came together, and declining the invitation was considered bad form. Lydia had not been invited. She was not a ranching family. She was a seamstress who had been mended back together by a hotel keeper's kindness after being discarded on the main street. But Grant was invited, and on the Saturday morning in question he appeared at Harper's Alterations before she had finished her coffee, and he was wearing his best coat and his hat was brushed and he looked, in short, extraordinarily good, and he said, "Would you do me the honor of accompanying me to the Whitfield gathering this evening, Lydia?" She stared at him. "I am aware," he said, with deliberate calm, "that going with me to a gathering at the home of the man who left you in the mud will be somewhat uncomfortable. I would not ask if I did not believe you were fully capable of handling it. I am asking because I would very much like to go with you, and because I think it would do Clover Ridge good to see that Percy Whitfield's failure of judgment in no way diminished you." She put down her coffee cup. She considered him for a long moment. "Are you inviting me as a statement of principle?" she asked. "I am inviting you," he said, "because there is no one whose company I would rather have this evening. The statement of principle is incidental." She smiled slowly. "Give me an hour to get ready," she said. She wore the blue dress, the one she had been making for herself over the past 3 weeks in the evenings, the one she had cut from the best wool she could afford and fitted with careful attention to every seam. It was a rich, deep blue that Nell Crane had described as the color of Wyoming sky at dusk, and it fit her with the precision of something made by someone who knew exactly how to make things fit. She put her hair up carefully, with the pearl pins that had been her mother's. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her hotel room and recognized, for the first time in a long time, the woman looking back at her. Grant was waiting for her outside, with a horse and buggy that was not showy but was clean and well kept, and when she came down the hotel steps he looked at her, really looked at her, for a long, steady moment and then said, "You look beautiful, Lydia," in a voice that was quiet and entirely sincere, and that went directly through every careful defense she had constructed. "Thank you," she said, and let him hand her up into the buggy. The Whitfield gathering was held in a large barn that had been cleared and decorated with autumn flowers and lanterns, and there were perhaps 70 people present by the time Grant and Lydia arrived. She felt the whisper move through the room when they came in together, the small, electric recognition of something notable happening, and she held her chin level, and kept her hand lightly on Grant's arm and reminded herself that she was Lydia Harper from Cincinnati, and she had sat in the mud of this town's main street and gotten back up again, and there was nothing in this barn that could touch her. Percy Whitfield was there. She saw him across the room, a sandy-haired man of medium height, with the look of someone who had spent most of his life being vaguely uncomfortable. He saw her at approximately the same moment and went still, the way people go still when confronted with the concrete evidence of their own poor behavior. She looked at him with a face that was completely composed and said nothing. Grant, who was beside her, said nothing either. But she felt his hand, lightly and briefly, cover hers where it rested on his arm, a small, deliberate gesture of solidarity that said more than any number of words. Percy Whitfield found a reason to be on the other side of the barn for the rest of the evening. She danced twice, once with Howard Crane, and once with a young ranch hand named Tom who was earnest and enthusiastic and had the footwork of a friendly scent. Bernard. She spent the rest of the evening in conversation with various women of the county, several of whom had opinions about her dressmaking work because word had traveled, and Grant stayed close enough that she was always aware of him but gave her enough space to manage her own conversations, which she appreciated enormously. At the end of the evening, driving back toward town through the dark with the stars enormous overhead and the night smelling of sage and cool air, she said, "That went better than I expected." "It usually does," he said. "Anticipated dread is generally worse than the event." Spoken like a man who has faced a few anticipated dreads himself. "One or two," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and in the starlight she could see the side of his face, the set of his jaw, the careful way he held the reins. "Lydia," he said, "yes, I would like to be honest with you about something." "I have found," she said carefully, "that your honesty is one of the things I appreciate most about you. Please go ahead." He was quiet for a moment longer, as though choosing his words with the same care he applied to everything else. "I have been coming to see you considerably more often than any practical purpose justifies," he said. "I am aware of this, and I believe you are as well. I wanted to say, plainly, that it is not habit or proximity or boredom that brings me. It is you specifically, and I wanted you to know that before I said anything further because it seemed important that you understand what I mean when I say it." She was very still. "And what do you intend to say further?" she asked, and her voice was entirely steady, which she considered a considerable achievement. "I would like to court you," he said, "formally, if you are willing. And if you are not willing, or if it is too soon, or if the entire situation of how you came to Clover Ridge makes the idea of any formal arrangement feel like something you would rather not revisit, I will understand that completely, and I will not press the matter, and we can go on as we are, which is something I value greatly." She looked at him in the starlight for a long moment. "Grant," she said. "Yes. I came to Wyoming Territory to build something," she said. "I told you that. And I have been building, slowly, carefully, with my own hands. But I also find that the evenings when you do not come to the workroom are considerably less interesting than the evenings when you do. And the conversations I have with you are the conversations I think about later. And when you put your hand over mine at the Whitfield gathering, I felt it for the rest of the evening." She paused. "I am a practical woman, and I do not say these things lightly, but I would be very glad if you would court me, Grant Rourke." The buggy had slowed almost to a stop, as though the horses were also paying attention. He turned to look at her fully, and even in the darkness she could see the expression on his face, open and warm, and something that might have been relief. The relief of a person who has been careful for a long time and is discovering that the carefulness is about to pay off. "Then I will," he said. The courtship was, by the standards of the Wyoming Territory in 1882, entirely proper. He came to see her at the workroom 3 times a week. He took her to Sunday service at the church, which prompted Martha to wear her best hat and sit 3 rows behind them with an expression of extreme satisfaction. He took her riding on the ranch property on Sunday afternoons, teaching her to handle a horse with the patient, practical teaching style of someone who genuinely wanted her to learn rather than simply to observe. She learned. She was not a natural rider, but she was determined, and by the end of October she could manage a steady canter without holding on for her life, and by November she was beginning to feel the particular pleasure of being on horseback in open country, which was a pleasure she had not expected, and which Grant watched her discover with quiet happiness. She met his ranch hands properly during these visits. There was Carlos, who was the foreman, a Mexican man of about 45 with vast experience and a dry humor that she immediately appreciated. There was Tom, the enthusiastic dancer from the Whitfield gathering, who was 20 and from Kansas, and treated her with the careful respect of someone who very much wanted to make a good impression on his employer's lady friend. There was older Jim, who had been with the ranch since Grant's father's time and who assessed her at their first meeting with the measuring look of someone who knew the ranch's history and took its future seriously, and who, after she had spent an afternoon helping treat a horse with a leg injury, alongside him and Grant with complete practicality and without complaint, pronounced her sensible, which Carlos told her later was the highest compliment in Jim's vocabulary. November brought snow, the first real snow she had ever seen, having lived her whole life in the relatively mild winters of Ohio. She stood outside the hotel on the morning of the first snowfall with her face tipped up and caught flakes on her tongue like a child, and then became aware that Grant was standing behind her watching, having arrived unannounced, and she straightened up with a dignity that was entirely undermined by the snowflakes still on her nose. He did not tease her. He simply stood beside her and looked at the street being covered in white. "It will get considerably more serious than this," he said. "Wyoming winters are not gentle." "I am not gentle either," she said. He looked at her sideways with that dark, warm expression. "No," he said, "you are not." It was the most affectionate thing anyone had ever said to her. Christmas came. She made him a shirt, the best one she had ever made, from a dark green fabric she had ordered specially from the supplies catalog, and she gave it to him on Christmas morning at the hotel, with Martha and Alice and Carlos and Tom all present for reasons that had everything to do with Martha's organizational tendencies and nothing to do with subtlety. He wore it immediately, putting it on over the shirt he was already wearing and buttoning it with a careful concentration that she found extraordinarily endearing. And when he looked up at her over the last button, his expression was the one she had begun to think of as the real one, the one underneath all the composure, the one that was just him. He gave her a set of dressmaking tools, professional grade, including scissors of such quality that she turned them over in her hands with something close to reverence, and a bolt of the finest silk she had seen since Cincinnati, in a deep cream color that she immediately knew she would make into something for herself. "That is entirely too extravagant," she told him. "It is entirely appropriate," he said. "You are extraordinarily good at your work and you deserve good tools." She looked at him across the small collection of gifts and people and said quietly, "Thank you, Grant." He said, equally quietly, "Merry Christmas, Lydia." January passed in snow and cold and long evenings in the hotel's sitting room with the fire going and Martha pretending to read her book while they talked for hours, about everything. His plans for expanding the ranch, her thoughts on opening a proper shop eventually, their memories of the places they had come from, their ideas about what kind of people they wanted to be. She told him about her father and her mother and the years of working alone after they were gone, and he listened in the way he always listened, with his whole attention, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment and then said, "You have been taking care of yourself for a long time, Lydia." "Yes," she said. "I would very much like it," he said carefully, "if you would let someone help with that." She looked at him over the firelight. "Are you asking me something in a rather circumspect way, Grant Rourke?" She said. He looked slightly less composed than usual, which she found entirely charming. "I am working my way toward asking you something," he admitted. "I wanted to be sure the context was right. The context is a fire and a January evening, and Martha 3 feet away pretending to be absorbed in a book she has not turned a page of in 20 minutes, Lydia said. I think the context is as right as it is likely to get. Martha made a sound that was absolutely not a laugh and turned a page. Grant looked at Lydia with the full version of his expression, the open, warm, entirely real one, and said, Lydia Harper, I have been falling in love with you since you were sitting in the mud on the main street of this town, and told me with complete composure that you were simply sitting. I would like to spend the rest of my life watching you handle impossible things with that particular kind of grace. I would like to offer you a home on the best land in this county, and a partnership that is exactly that, a partnership, because you have shown me in every week since September that you are the person I have been looking for without knowing precisely what I was looking for. He paused. Will you marry me? The fire crackled. Martha had, by this point, given up entirely on the pretense of reading, and was watching them with bright eyes. Lydia felt something in her chest open like a door that had been closed for a very long time, letting light in from a direction she had not expected. Yes, she said. I will marry you, Grant Rourke. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and he held it the way he did everything, firmly and carefully and with complete attention, and she felt more settled and more arrived than she had felt at any point in her adult life. Martha did make a sound then, definitely a sound, something between a satisfied sigh and a barely suppressed cheer, and when they both looked at her she picked up her book with magnificent dignity and said, I am very happy for you both. Now I need more tea. Alice. They were married in April when the snow was melting and the land was coming back to life in the particular vibrant, urgent way of the Wyoming spring. The church in Clover Ridge was full. Every ranching family in the county came, and all of Grant's hands, and Martha in her best hat, which was a genuinely excellent hat, and Howard and Nell Crane, who wept openly, and Dr. Finch, who did not weep but looked pleased, and Alice, who was wearing the dress Lydia had made her for the occasion in a forget-me-not blue that suited her tremendously. Lydia wore the silk. The cream silk from the bolt Grant had given her at Christmas, made into a dress that was simple and perfectly fitted and more beautiful than anything she had sewn before because she had made it for herself, and for this day, and had brought every skill she had to it. Her mother's pearl pins were in her hair. She carried a small bunch of the first spring flowers, gathered that morning from the creek bank behind the ranch by Tom, who had made a point of it. She walked down the aisle of the small church with her arm in Martha's, because Martha was the closest thing she had to family in this place, and Martha had not needed to be asked. She walked steadily and with her chin level and her eyes on Grant, who was standing at the front of the church looking at her with an expression that was, for once, entirely unguarded, all his careful composure set aside for this one moment. And what she saw on his face was everything she had hoped for and more than she had let herself expect. The ceremony was simple and direct, performed by the Reverend Howell, who kept it to the essentials without shortchanging the gravity of it. When Grant said, I will, his voice was steady and absolute, and when Lydia said it, her voice matched his. He put the ring on her finger, a ring he had ordered from a jeweler in Laramie, a gold band set with a small ruby, because he had told the jeweler he wanted something the color of strength, and the jeweler had understood him or perhaps had simply had the right thing in stock, but either way it was perfect. When the Reverend Howell said they might consider the ceremony complete, Grant kissed her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, thoroughly and gently, and without the slightest concern for who was watching, and the assembled population of Clover Ridge expressed their approval with a warmth that shook the windows. They had a wedding supper at the hotel, because Martha had insisted on hosting it, and the hotel's main room had been cleared and decorated with spring flowers and ribbons by Nell Crane and half a dozen willing women who had spent the entire previous day in cheerful industriousness. There was dancing. Grant danced with her twice, and on the second dance held her closer than strict propriety required, which she could not bring herself to object to. Carlos danced with Martha, which surprised everyone including both of them. Tom danced with Alice and knocked over a flower arrangement and apologized to it directly, which was the funniest thing anyone present had ever seen. She had been in Clover Ridge for 7 months. She had come here as a discarded bride sitting in the mud, and she was leaving the hotel this evening as Lydia Rourke, with her hand in her husband's hand and the night sky over Wyoming enormous and brilliant overhead. The ranch house was warm and lit with lamplight when they arrived, because Carlos had sent Tom ahead to see to the fires, and there were fresh flowers on the kitchen table, which made her stop in the doorway for a moment. "Tom," Grant said, seeing her expression. "Tom," she confirmed and laughed, and felt the laughter move through her like something being released. She stood in her own house for the first time, looking at the kitchen and the sitting room and the stairs going up, and the fire in the hearth, and her husband standing in the lamplight watching her discover it. "Well," she said, "it is going to need some work." Grant looked startled and then looked where she was looking, at the curtains which were functional but not particularly attractive, and the wall that could use a fresh coat of whitewash, and the shelves that wanted organizing. "I expect it does," he agreed, recovering admirably. "I have ideas," she told him. "I expected you might," he said, and the warmth in his voice made the words into something that had nothing to do with curtains. She came into the room properly and stood in front of him and put her hands flat on his chest, feeling his heartbeat under her palms, steady and present and real. "Grant," she said. "Lydia," he said. "I am very glad you stepped off that horse," she said. He put his hands over hers, the same way he had in the buggy on the way home from the Whitfield gathering, covering them completely. "So am I," he said, "more than I can tell you." She went up on her toes and kissed him, there in their kitchen in their house, on the first night of their life together. The first year of their marriage was, in the way of first years on a working ranch, both harder and better than anything she had imagined. She learned what it meant to live on the land in a way that hotel life and the workroom had only suggested. She learned the rhythms of the calving season and the cattle drives, the particular exhaustion of spring and the quieter steadiness of winter. She kept the ranch accounts, because she was considerably better with numbers than Grant, who admitted this with the honesty that was characteristic of him. And she found that managing the finances of a substantial operation engaged a part of her intelligence that had always been somewhat underused. She also kept the workroom in town, because Grant had never suggested she should not, and on the 3 days a week she was in Clover Ridge, she continued to build her dressmaking business with steady, patient skill. She hired a girl in the late spring of their first year, a young woman named Rosa, who was 17, the daughter of a Mexican family who had settled 5 miles east of town, and who was a quick learner and had good hands. Teaching Rosa was one of the most satisfying things Lydia had done in years, watching competence develop in someone who wanted it and worked for it. Rosa had a younger brother with bright eyes who helped at the ranch occasionally, and she had a mother whose tamales were the finest thing Lydia had eaten since she came west, and who brought a tray to the workroom every time she came to collect Rosa, a habit that Lydia encouraged with every means available to her. Carlos and Martha had, by the end of the first year of Lydia and Grant's marriage, developed a friendship of considerable depth and stubborn mutual denial. Grant noticed it first, one Sunday when they were all at the hotel for supper, and he watched Carlos hold Martha's chair with a careful, quiet attention that had nothing casual in it. And he looked at Lydia across the table with a significant expression that she returned with equivalent significance. They did not meddle, because Grant felt strongly that people needed to find their own way and Lydia was in full agreement, but they watched with interest and were glad when, the following spring, Carlos began driving to town on Saturday evenings for no stated purpose that aligned with ranch business. She was 5 months along with their first child when she finished the new curtains for the sitting room, and she sat back and looked at them with the satisfaction of a job done right, and then felt the baby move in a way that was unmistakable and called for Grant. He came in from the yard still carrying the tool he had been using, a hammer, and stopped when he saw her face. "Now," he said with a calm that she recognized as the version he produced when he was not calm. "Not now," she said. "Just moving. Come feel." He crossed the room and took her hand, and she pressed it to the side where the movement had been, and after a moment there it was again, and he went very still in the way he sometimes went still when something reached him deeply. "That," he said quietly, "is remarkable." "Yes," she agreed. He looked at her with an expression that combined all the versions she had catalogued over the past 2 years, the warm, the thoughtful, the amused, the open, the completely unguarded, all together at once, and she felt the full weight of how much he loved her as though she could hold it in her hands. "I love you," he said. It was the thing he said rarely and with complete intention, and every time it meant exactly what it said. "I love you too," she told him. "Now please do not track mud past the new curtains." He looked down at his boots, which were indeed muddy, and reversed his steps with dignity. The baby was born on a November morning, blue-skied and sharp-cold, with Dr. Finch in attendance, and Martha pacing the kitchen downstairs with a cup of tea she kept forgetting to drink. Grant stayed because Lydia asked him to stay, and because there was no possibility of him not staying, and he held her hand through the whole of it and did not flinch from any of it, which she appreciated enormously. The child was a boy, solid and red-faced, and spectacularly loud for something so small, and they named him Thomas Edward Rourke after both their fathers. When Grant held him for the first time, sitting on the edge of the bed with the newborn careful in his big hands, and his expression entirely demolished by something that was probably love and terror in equal measure, Lydia thought she had never seen anything so right in her life. Martha came up immediately after and cried, which was the only time Lydia ever saw Martha cry, and was therefore extremely notable. Tom, the ranch hand, who had been pacing in the yard alongside the horses because he had been sent outside 4 hours earlier and not been brought back in, was given the news by Carlos and made a sound that was emphatically not crying but may have been adjacent to it. Thomas Edward Rourke was, from his first weeks of life, a strong-willed and opinionated person in the mold of both his parents, which kept everyone on the ranch in a state of affectionate exasperation. He reached his first birthday demanding more complex entertainment than Rattles could provide, and by his second birthday, he was following Carlos around the ranch as though he had personally employed the foreman for his own educational purposes. The second child came 2 years after Thomas, in the early spring, a girl they named Clara after Grant's mother, who had died when he was young and whom he spoke of rarely, but with the particular gentleness of a sustained and quiet grief. Clara was smaller than Thomas at birth and quieter, with dark eyes like her father and Lydia's determined set to her mouth, and she grew into a child of great precision and observation who spoke when she had something worth saying, which they all eventually realized she had inherited in equal measure from both parents. The workroom had become a proper shop by the time Clara was born. Lydia had rented the street-facing room from Howard Crane, who had retired from active management of the store and was glad of the steady income, and the sign above the door now said, "Rourke's Dressmaking," in new painted letters that Lydia herself had done on a dry August morning, with the door propped open, and Thomas sitting on the step being supervised by Rosa. The shop served customers from as far as 30 miles away, because word of quality traveled in the territory, and Rosa had become a fully capable dressmaker in her own right, which Lydia considered one of her better accomplishments. Grant expanded the ranch in their 3rd year of marriage, buying a parcel of adjacent land from a family that was moving further west and could not take the herd with them. This expansion was something he had been considering for 2 years and discussed with Lydia extensively before making any decision, because he ran the major decisions of the ranch past her with the same thoroughness that she ran major decisions of the shop past him, which was one of the foundations of their partnership, and the thing that the other ranching couples in the county looked at with varying combinations of admiration and bewilderment. Percy Whitfield sold his ranch in the summer of their third year and moved to Denver, which Lydia heard about through Nell Crane with the same detached interest she might have felt hearing about a distant thunderstorm. He had finally married to a woman from Cheyenne who had apparently been given a more accurate picture of the situation before she arrived, and the marriage had lasted approximately 14 months before the woman had returned to Cheyenne with considerable efficiency. The ranch sale was amicable and Grant had considered buying the parcel, but it was too far south and the water situation was complicated, and he had let it go. She did not waste any emotion on Percy Whitfield. She had forgiven him in the abstract, some time ago, in the way that you forgive something that did you an unintentional kindness. He had left her in the mud on the main street of Clover Ridge in the rain, and Grant Rourke had stepped off his horse, and she had been building a life of more genuine happiness and solidity than anything she had imagined when she answered an advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette. The telegram that had dissolved her arrangements had also, it turned out, directed her toward something far better than the arrangement had ever been. She did not thank Percy for this, because it would have been strange, but she did occasionally find it remarkable. Carlos and Martha were married quietly in the spring of the fourth year, at the church in Clover Ridge, with only Grant and Lydia and Rosa and Tom present, because Martha had said firmly that one large wedding was enough for this acquaintance group, and she was not having a fuss. It was a small ceremony of remarkable dignity and considerable warmth, and when Carlos looked at Martha at the altar with the expression of a man who had found, late and unexpectedly, the thing he had been waiting for without knowing it, Lydia pressed her hand against the side of Grant's arm and felt him squeeze it gently, and they did not need to say anything. The fourth year also brought a hard winter and a difficult calving season, when a late storm killed several of the younger cattle, and the losses were significant. Grant dealt with it with the steady practicality of someone who had worked through setbacks before, and Lydia dealt with it by sitting down with the accounts and identifying every possible economy without compromising the ranch's operations or the wages of the hands, and between them they managed the year without lasting damage. The lesson of it, she thought, was that the things you built together were stronger than the things you built alone, not because sharing the weight halved it, but because sharing the thinking multiplied the solutions. Thomas at 4 was attempting to ride horses under Carlos's supervision, with the relentless enthusiasm and almost complete disregard for caution that was entirely his own personality. Clara at 2 was watching him from the fence with an expression that managed to combine admiration and a quiet assessment of risk that made Lydia wonder, with private amusement, what kind of person her daughter was going to be. The fifth year of their marriage was the year Lydia expanded the shop significantly, taking on a second workroom and a third seamstress, a young woman named Helen whose family had recently arrived in the territory from Missouri. It was also the year that the Clover Ridge Ladies' Aid Society, which organized the social and practical welfare of the community, in ways that the men's organizations could not or did not bother with, asked Lydia to become its chairwoman, a position she accepted with the pragmatic awareness that she had been quietly doing much of the chair's work informally for the past 2 years anyway. The Aid Society undertook, in Lydia's first year as chair, the project of raising funds for a proper schoolhouse to replace the inadequate building that had served Clover Ridge since the town's founding. Grant contributed materially to this project, which surprised no one, but more usefully, he contributed contacts with the builders and suppliers that meant the project was completed in 8 months rather than the 2 years it might otherwise have taken. The new schoolhouse opened in the fall of that year with a ceremony at which Lydia gave a brief address, and Thomas attended school for the first time, in new trousers that his mother had made, and with his father's dark eyes and his mother's chin, looking simultaneously very small and very determined. On the evening of their 5th anniversary, Grant gave her a necklace that had been his mother's, a simple gold chain with a small pendant of amber that had come from Virginia with the family 40 years before. He put it around her neck at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, with the steady, careful attention he brought to everything he considered significant, and she reached up and held the pendant in her fingers and felt the continuity of it, the long thread of people and places and decisions that had wound through time to deposit her here in this kitchen on this land with this man. 5 years, she said. 5 years, he agreed. He sat down across from her and looked at her with the expression that was entirely his, the one that had moved from careful warmth to full and unguarded love over the course of those 5 years, with the kind of depth and solidity that could only come from actually knowing someone. "You came west to build something," he said. "I did," she said. "Have you built it?" She looked around the kitchen, at the house that was fully theirs now, at the evidence of the children in the drawings on the wall and the boots by the door, and the book Thomas had left on the table, at the window that looked out over their land in the evening light. "We built it," she said. "That is better." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, the way he had on their first carriage drive home, the way he had at the church on the morning of their wedding, the way he had every time the world gave them something large to hold. Outside the window, the Wyoming sky was doing what Wyoming skies did in October evenings, turning through a sequence of colors that no painter had ever fully captured, and that Lydia, who had been watching it for 5 years, was still not entirely used to. The gold going to rose, going to that deep purple blue that sat above the mountains like a blessing. Thomas came downstairs at that point, in his night clothes, claiming thirst, and Grant went to get him water without releasing Lydia's hand until the last possible moment, and she heard them in the kitchen, Grant's low voice and Thomas's high one. And then Clara called from upstairs in the determined way she had when she considered herself to have been overlooked, and Lydia went up and settled her back into her blankets and stood in the dark room listening to her daughter breathe, steady and peaceful, and felt the full, particular weight of a life that was genuinely and completely hers. The 6th year brought her 3rd pregnancy, announced one February morning with a matter-of-fact certainty that made Grant look up from the accounts with an expression that was entirely the same as it had been the first and second time, as though the news was new to him in all the ways that mattered even when it was familiar. This child was another boy, born in August and named James Edward Rourke, called Jamie, who arrived in the world with Thomas's volume and Clara's precision of observation, and some additional quality entirely his own that it would take years to fully identify, but that seemed initially to be an enormous tolerance for complexity. Rosa married in the spring of the year Jamie was born, to a young carpenter named William who had come to Clover Ridge to work on the schoolhouse construction, and found, correctly, that leaving after the project was finished would be a significant mistake. The wedding was held in the church, and Lydia made Rosa's dress in a white that was as fine as anything produced in Cincinnati, and Rosa's mother brought tamales to the reception, and the evening ended with dancing that went considerably past any reasonable hour and was worth every minute of it. She trained a 4th seamstress the following year, and began taking orders from Cheyenne and Laramie, which required organization and a correspondence practice that she managed with the efficient pleasure of someone who was genuinely good at what they did. Grant read her business correspondence with the same interested attention he brought to everything she did, occasionally offering observations that were useful, and always with the underlying quality of a person who respected what he was looking at. They argued, as people do, about the cattle and the finances and the children and the best use of the land, and whether Thomas at 7 was old enough to have more independence on the ranch, which was a disagreement that lasted several weeks and was resolved in a compromise that satisfied both of them adequately. She learned that Grant's composure, when it broke in a direction of quiet intensity rather than raised voices, that his disagreements were stated plainly, and then listened to in return with the same plainness, and that the resolution of a genuine argument between them left the ground clearer than it had been before, which was the most you could ask of any disagreement. He learned that Lydia's practicality was not an absence of feeling but its most complete expression, that when she was most upset, she became most organized, and that the appropriate response to finding her in a state of extreme household management was to sit down, close enough to touch, and wait until she was ready to talk about whatever had prompted the management. He had gotten very good at this. Tom the ranch hand left for a homestead of his own in the 7th year, in Nevada, with the kind of hopeful purpose that deserved a good sending off. Grant gave him a reference that was genuinely deserved and 3 months additional wages as a start, and Lydia made him a quilt that she had been working on in secret for 2 months, and the whole of the ranch and most of the town turned out to see him off, which took 3 hours longer than the departure time Tom had stated because every person who came to wish him well had several things to say to him. He left with tears in his eyes that he attributed to dust, which everyone accepted without comment. They hired a new hand, a young man named Diego who was Carlos's second nephew, and who proved himself inside the first week by managing a cattle problem with a calm competence that made Carlos very satisfied and Grant very grateful. In the fall of that year, Lydia stood in the workroom of her shop, which had a 3rd room now and 4 seamstresses and orders backed up 3 months, and she looked at the work on the table, and the women working alongside her, and the town visible through the window and thought, with the particular clarity that came occasionally without warning, that this was what she had come west to find. Not the safety of an arranged marriage, not the security of being claimed by someone else's project, but this, something she had built with her own hands from the ground up, piece by piece, in a place that had first received her from the mud of its own main street and then become hers completely. She thought about the woman who had sat in that mud, soaked and abandoned and holding a ruined telegram, and she felt for her a tenderness that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with recognition. That woman had not been broken by what happened to her. She had been sitting in the mud assessing the situation, which was exactly what the situation required. It had just taken someone stepping off a horse and asking if she was injured to remind her that there were people in the world who asked that kind of question. She finished the hem she was working on and put her work down and walked to the window and looked out at the main street of Clover Ridge, which was busy in the middle of the afternoon, with the normal activity of a western town going about its business. A wagon from one of the outlying ranches pulled past. 2 women from the Aid Society walked together on the opposite boardwalk, deep in conversation about something that required considerable hand gestures. Howard Crane swept his storefront with the same methodical sweep he had used every day for 20 years. She heard hoofbeats and looked up the street, and there was Grant coming in from the ranch road at the easy, unhurried pace that meant it was not an emergency, and he had ridden in because he wanted to, not because anything required it. She watched him ride up and stop outside the shop and step down from the horse in the same single, practiced motion she had been watching for 7 years and not yet found uninteresting, and he tied the horse at the post and came through the door. He looked at her at the window and smiled. "I came to ask if you wanted to ride home with me this evening," he said. "The light is going to be something worth seeing. The sky has been building all afternoon." She looked back at him. This man who had stepped off a horse in the rain on the main street of a town she had never seen before and asked if she was injured, who had covered her hand with his in a buggy under the stars and told her what he meant before he said it, who had held her hand through 2 births and 1 difficult winter and 1 very long argument about livestock, and stood in the kitchen at midnight with a sick child because she was not going to be there alone, who had built something with her that was larger and deeper and more genuinely his own self than anything she had imagined in a Cincinnati boarding house reading an advertisement in the Gazette. "Let me finish this scene," she said. 10 minutes. He sat down on the client's stool and picked up the newspaper that was sitting on the side table and read it with complete contentment, and she went back to her work, and the workroom was warm and quiet with the sound of stitching and the occasional page turn. And through the window the Wyoming sky was indeed building into something extraordinary, all gold and copper at the edges, and the great blue vault above deepening into the color of stones under water. 10 minutes later she put down her work, told Rosa to lock up, took her coat from the hook and went out the door with her husband. They rode home together in the evening light, side by side, with the sky doing exactly what he had promised, and the mountains catching the last of the gold and the sage-scented air moving over the grass in the low places. And behind them, the town of Clover Ridge settled into its evening routine. And ahead of them their house had lights in the windows because Clara had apparently lit the lamps without being asked, which was entirely characteristic. And somewhere inside the sound of Thomas and Jamie, involved in whatever they were involved in today, was audible from 30 yards away. Grant reached across the space between the horses and took her hand. She held it as they rode the last quarter-mile home, through the gate with the Rourke Ranch sign that had been there when she arrived, and that now included her as completely as if she had been part of this land all along. The house received them as it always did, with warmth and noise and the particular organized chaos of a home that was genuinely lived in, and Clara opened the door before they had dismounted, and announced that supper was ready because she had told Rosaria the cook that 7 was the right time and it was now 7. And Thomas was arguing with Jamie about something that had been going on for 2 days, and could someone please resolve it. And Jamie himself appeared behind Clara with the face of someone who considered himself unjustly treated. Grant and Lydia exchanged a look over the heads of their children, the look that contained everything, the difficulty and the joy and the work and the love, all of it together, and then they went inside. The door closed behind them. The Wyoming sky continued its long display of extravagant color outside, unhurried and magnificent, over the ranch and the town and the mountains and the wide, wild territory that was still becoming itself, still raw and real and full of possibility, in the year that was moving steadily toward its close, and the year after that already gathering somewhere on the horizon, patient and unhurried as a man who knew what he was waiting for, and was entirely prepared to wait for it to be right. Inside, the fire was going, and supper was on the table, and Thomas and Jamie's dispute was resolved in the diplomatic way Grant had of reaching the heart of a disagreement and redirecting it without making anyone feel defeated. Clara set the plates with the precision she brought to every task. Rosaria brought the bread from the kitchen and said something that made Grant laugh, the full laugh, the one that went all the way through him. Lydia sat at her table in her house on her land and watched her family in the lamplight and felt the accumulated weight of everything that had led here. The telegram, the rain, the mud, the carpetbag, the coin, the coffee, the measuring tape, the buggy, the courtship, the wedding, the children, the work, the arguments, the long evenings and the difficult winters and the spring mornings when the mist came off the creek and everything was clear. All of it had been necessary. All of it had been hers. She had come to Wyoming territory to build something. She had.